Good evening and welcome to Hello It's Us. Hello It's Us is dedicated to educating the general public about issues that are important to the disability community, and we're operating under the premise that those of you viewing this realize that the same issues that are important to the disability community are important to everyone. The Hello It's Us is brought to you through a collaboration between the University of Iowa Center for Disabilities and Development, our friends at Uptown Bill's Coffee Shop, and the good people here at Public Access Television. My name is Mike Hoenig. I work for the Center for Disabilities and Development, and I serve as one of the co-hosts for Hello It's Us. Keith?
My name is Keith Ruff. I'm the other co-host. I'm retired from the local independent living center, and I'm writing a book.
And we're still waiting for that book to be done so we can interview you.
Yes.
Well, we're really excited about tonight's show. We're very pleased to have a guest who drove all the way from Des Moines to be here to join us. Her name is Reyma McCoy-McDeid. She is the director of the Central Iowa Center for Independent Living in Des Moines, as well as chairwoman of an organization called Disability Votes Count, which we are going to be talking about this evening. Welcome, Reyma.
Welcome, Reyma.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you for coming.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, let's start out and just tell us a little bit about yourself, your interest in disability, and anything that you consider relevant, and kind of winding it up with how you acquired such an interest in voting.
Well, that's a bit of a mouthful.
That is, isn't it?
I'll try to not give the 300-page synopsis. I'm the executive director of Central Iowa Center for Independent Living in Des Moines, and we like to say that we are people with disabilities serving people with disabilities. And so I, as the director, also have a disability. I have Asperger's syndrome, which is a form of autism, and I have been interested in human services my entire life, both as a recipient of services and as a provider of services. And I think that, like many of us who experience disability, I know firsthand the experience of feeling like I am disenfranchised from the larger system. And so I have, as a result, been very interested and passionate about voting for the majority of my life. And with regards to really engaging in the political process here in the state of Iowa, I would say that really came to a head this year as conversations about Medicaid privatization became more and more proliferate in conversation here in the state. As a provider of services to many people who are Medicaid members, was faced with the challenge of providing peer support to people who are frustrated with the anticipated changes to their health care. And the question that I was met with more often than not was, I'm angry and I don't know what to do about that. And the question I would ask of people was, are you voting? Are you registered to vote? And shockingly enough, more often than not, the answer was no. And the thing is that those of us with disabilities are the largest minority group in the state of Iowa. There are 315,000 people who are eligible to vote in the state who also experience a disability. We are also one of the most underrepresented groups in the state. And so for me, Medicaid privatization really spearheaded this drive to really change that paradigm and do the work that helps to ensure that Iowa's largest minority group is showing up to the polls and is actively participating in the decisions that are being made that directly impact them. And so with that came Iowa Disability Votes Count, which is now a 501c3 and is led entirely by people with disabilities throughout the state of Iowa. And 2016 is a very pivotal election year, and so we've really been doing a lot of grassroots reaching out to people across the state, connecting people with disabilities and candidates, and facilitating conversations amongst these groups, and creating meetings of the minds, if you will, with the objective of getting people with disabilities out to vote at every possible opportunity, obviously.
Yeah,
So-
you handled that mouthful question really,
Yeah.
really well.
You did. Reyma, having a disability yourself, how do you coach your staff to be more vigilant about disability?
I speak about experiencing a disability. I bring it up in conversation. I think that there are a lot of misconceptions about those of us who have disabilities.
Yes.
Certainly our group experiences an astronomically high unemployment rate. And so there's a misconception that many of us are unemployable, and certainly the majority of us are not in leadership positions or are decision makers. And so I feel that it's my responsibility, given the fortunate opportunity I have to be in a leadership position at an organization, to speak about being a person with a disability, because it helps to demystify that experience for people. And more often than not, I can be in conversation with someone about disability, and when I myself reveal that I experience a disability, it can bring a very interesting dynamic to the conversation, which tells me that a lot of people are not necessarily accustomed to being in conversation with people with disabilities. And so for me, visibility is key. Visibility and communication about the experience.
I find that interesting, and I've had many learning experiences from people with so-called invisible disabilities. And my first one that I'll never ever forget is when I was working at a SIL, and she, excuse me, was someone with a learning disability, and she was having a really challenging day. And at the end of the day, she came to me and asked if I would go close her windows because she couldn't close them on that particular day. And I said, well, come on, what is there about closing a window that would present you a problem?
Sure.
And she said, I just wish once in my life someone, if I asked for an accommodation, would just honor it and not ask me to prove that I have a particular disability. And man, that was really an eye-opener.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they're with people with disabilities being the largest minority group, not only in the state, but also in the country,
Yes.
and also on the planet. There's an incredible amount of diversity within our group, and we have people who have invisible disabilities, people with visible disabilities, and everything in between. And I certainly experience at times the stigma of having an invisible disability, and sometimes having to prove that I'm disabled enough, and I catch myself sometimes doing that and telling people, well, I was almost institutionalized when I was 13, and I grew up in foster care and group homes, and so I have just as much right to claim disability as anybody else does, and that's not really necessary. And I think, again, with more visibility and more communication and conversation about the disability experience, the more that we'll understand that there's a lot of diversity here, and there's definitely room at the table for all of us.
Absolutely.
Do you feel that with the advent of ADA, that this generation coming up with it, there'll be more leadership than ever before?
Absolutely, absolutely. The ADA generation doesn't know a society that the society that existed pre-ADA,
right.
and so they take it for granted that there are ramps and that there are accommodations made to buildings and that kind of thing. And that's a good thing to take for granted. I want my daughter, I have a daughter who's 2 years old, and I want her to take that for granted and expect that whenever she's in a public place. Expect that that space is as ADA compliant as possible.
I wanted to, excuse me, I wanted to go back to something you said a little while ago when you were introducing the concept of disability votes count, and I think it'll relate right back to this issue that we're talking about with accessibility and the ADA, and that is you said that as you asked people whether they were registered to vote, people with disabilities, you found out that that number was surprisingly high that were not registered.
Yes.
Do you have a sense of some of the reasons, anyway, that number is, that percentage is so high?
Yes, there are certainly barriers that people with disabilities experience to participating in the political process. I like to say that the good news is that the biggest barrier is simply misconception. There are misconceptions with regards to simply having a disability excluding someone from the political process. And fortunately in the state of Iowa, the only reason why someone with a disability would be ineligible to vote would be because they've stood before a judge and that judge has declared them not competent to vote. The vast majority of people who have a disability in the state of Iowa are eligible to vote, or at least not ineligible to vote because of their disability. That misconception spills into the surrounding support system for many people with disabilities, and parents, guardians, advocates, service providers who are operating under the misconception that their loved one has a disability, and it could even be a disability that's very impactful, and because of that disability cannot or maybe even should not participate in the political process. That is not for a parent, guardian, advocate, service provider, or any other stakeholder in that person's life. That's not a decision for them to make. Again, the only reason why someone with a disability would not be able to vote is because a judge has declared them not able to vote. And
okay, go ahead.
And then I think the other misconception that creates a barrier to voting is that if a person's not able to, for whatever reason, go to that polling place on election day, they can't vote. Well, we've got early voting in the state. September 27th is the first day that we can early vote in the state of Iowa. There is curbside voting, and so if a person is able to get themselves transported to that polling place on election day, they can actually have the staff from the polling place meet them out at their car with a ballot, and they can fill out their ballot at the car. And so that's another way that a person with a disability can participate without necessarily going inside of a polling place on election day. And so I think those are the three big misconceptions that keep people with disabilities from participating in the political process in Iowa.
Besides what you just stated, have you or your staff noticed any physical barriers that could be a problem?
Certainly, many polling places leave much to be desired as far as accessibility is concerned. We all know that. Every time we come together to caucus, you know, we have over 1,800 sites to caucus in the state of Iowa, and sometimes those sites are not accessible. Sometimes polling places are not as accessible as we would like them to be. And I think that the conversations that I've had with representatives from both political parties, what I'm told is that everyone is doing what they can to ensure that the most accessible spaces are utilized for voting and for caucusing, but everyone understands that there's still a lot of work to be done, and so it's an ongoing process. But I think that an important piece is people with disabilities going to the polling places, having their experiences, and especially if it's a non-positive experience, letting that be known, reaching out to the Iowa GOP or the Iowa Democratic Party, the Secretary of State, and letting them know, hey, I tried to vote, and this is what I encountered at that polling place. What can we do to make it right so that I can participate in the political process?
I imagine you found it more difficult when the caucuses because of the winter weather.
The weather, the timing, transportation, lots of barriers that are encountered with caucusing. And again, both the Iowa GOP and the Iowa Democratic Party, I think, are doing what they can to have conversations about caucus accessibility. The Iowa Democratic Party has actually pulled together a caucus review committee that meets on a regular basis. I'm actually part of that. The entire purpose of that committee is to capture information about caucus experiences and use that information to ensure that caucus accessibility and other challenges that are encountered at the caucuses are minimized as much as possible. In addition, Disability Rights Iowa put out a survey earlier this year that allowed for the capturing of information on people's caucus experiences with regards to accessibility. And I know that both the Iowa Democratic Party and the Iowa GOP have that information and are working to incorporate that feedback into their conversations about improving caucus accessibility. So
That's good. I'm a caucus goer, and one of the things that happens, I think, for those of us with disabilities who choose to participate, really in any process, is that we have to make some decisions along the way about, what are we going to go to bat for, and what are we going to let stand. And I happen to, in our caucus, you actually write down your choice. Well, obviously, I couldn't do that and have it be legible, and they're certainly not going to read Braille. So I ended up having to go actually I was going to ask the precinct chair, and as it turned out, I ran into a friend who did it. But, I felt in some way that I was betraying the disability advocacy community a bit because I didn't push harder, but yet I wanted to have my vote counted. And
right.
I think we as people with disabilities run into those kinds of decision points often, and it's just a little frustrating when you're, the privacy of the vote, and yet you have to make that choice sometimes.
Yes, it's certainly not ideal. I myself, at my precinct, when I caucused, I was met with an extremely large crowd of people, fluorescent lights, lots of noise, and I have sensory processing disorder, which is a component of being on the autism spectrum, and I became very overstimulated very quickly to the point of where I wanted to physically run from my caucus precinct and just leave. Fortunately, I found a room that was adjacent to where we were caucusing that was dark and no one was in it, and so what I chose to do was just go into the room and kind of listen for any activity amongst caucusers so that I could step out and participate. And so I think that part of our experience as people with disabilities is becoming very adaptive to our surroundings, almost hyper-adaptive sometimes overcompensating for the lack or the challenges to accessibility that we constantly encounter in our daily lives. And of course, I personally would love to see a day where we're not talking about accommodations, we're talking about universal accessibility, so that we're not trying to make something that doesn't work for everybody kind of work for the most of us, shifting from that to this works for everybody, so let's do this.
I like that. I hope we get there sometime
Hopefully
soon.
my daughter will see that
Yeah.
day, so, yeah.
You mentioned, we've talked a little bit about the curbside voting,
Yes.
and we've talked a little bit about, the issues with physical accessibility, and you've just shared a personal story about some of the environmental issues. I know that from personal experience, that there are also some issues, some accommodations rather, that allow people, whether they happen to be blind or whether they, for some other reason, can't read or process a standard ballot.
Yes.
Yeah, lost the word there. To still be able to vote at the polling place. Would you like to talk a little bit about those?
Well, and again, we're talking about accommodating an imperfect process. And so in our state, a person can receive assistance in filling out their ballot from anybody except for their employer or an agent of their union. And by union, I mean someone from their workers' union if they're a union member.
Did not know that.
And so that's great. But again, there's that confidentiality piece that is lost, that many of
Yeah.
us kind of treasure when we are participating in the political process, not wanting to lay all of our cards out on the table, so to speak. And so that is unfortunately compromised if we need to pull someone in to support us in filling out our ballot because we're not able to decipher it for whatever reason. And so again, it's an accommodation to an imperfect process. And certainly there are alternatives that are available, and they require an investment of time and money and resources, certainly, but there are electronic means of filling out a ballot and that kind of thing. And I certainly hope to see that technology come to the state as soon as possible. And every precinct, every polling place, because sometimes we encounter more advanced technology at one polling place than at another, or in one county than another, and I think that brings challenges with it as well. And so
I'm fortunate to live in a county, and I believe Johnson County also has the electronic devices. And
yes,
so
I think so.
Yeah, and I live in Scott County, and we do too. The interesting piece of that is that many times the election officials don't know how to operate
Yes.
them properly, so we
Yes.
have to go in and do a little education before we can vote. But it is, for those counties who do have them, and of course that again, as you said, is a great expense. And I know when our county was considering getting them, there were questions about, well, how many people will use them?
Yes.
And unfortunately, the sad thing is, I've been told in my precinct that sometimes I am the only person that uses the electronic device, and that's really, when we want to try to make the case for the next generation, or
Yeah.
even for, and there's such low turnout. That's just another reason I think that we have to get people out voting.
And that's why Iowa Disability Votes Count exists, and that's why we do systems advocacy at the 6 Sills in the state of Iowa, because we've got to change that paradigm. We simply must. It's been said often by many people that when we are not sitting at the table, we end up on the menu, and we've got to shift that paradigm with our group, with people with disabilities, and I really feel like 2016 is the beginning of a shift as far as the disability vote is concerned. So,
It has to be.
yes, it does have to be. It does. Yeah.
And we should have enough highly educated disabled people by now to make an informed vote if they go out and
Yes.
vote.
Yeah. I totally agree. Yeah.
Well, and along those lines, what are some of the some suggestions that you might have for people with disabilities to get educated about the issues?
Well, I think that for me, it's been incredibly important to get beyond the handouts and the pamphlets. There's a wealth of information available out there about voting rights and voting facts that information's available by handout. And I know that a lot of service providers, as a means of educating clients with disabilities on voting, will get these handouts and hand them off to people. And that's great, but I think that what's really crucial is connecting people with disabilities with candidates and elected officials. And so for me personally, it's been very important to me to reach out to my elected officials, to reach out to candidates for office, and engage them in conversation about the issues that impact me and the issues that impact the people that I work with at CISL. That's where the power is, because that puts a face to things.
Yes.
And a handout can only go so far. And so it's when we show up to the Capitol, or when we show up to rallies, or when we show up to any place where a candidate or an elected official is. And we, with Iowa Disability Votes Count, we go to fundraisers, we go anywhere, forums, anywhere that candidates and elected officials are. And we try to get face time with them as much as possible. That's, to me, where the power is.
Well, that's great. Reyma, are you able to join us for another episode, for another segment?
I sure am.
Well, excellent. We're coming close to the end of what is going to be part one of our two-part series. I know I have a number of questions that we haven't had a chance to talk about, and I'm sure, Keith, you do too.
I do too.
So we'll go ahead and end this episode by saying thanks to you, Reyma, again for taking your time to come from Des Moines, and thank all of you out there viewing this episode on PATV, and certainly encourage you to stay around or to tune in again next week for part two, when we will start really diving into the activities of Disability Votes Count.
Have a good week.